Good morning. Welcome back to our third Anchored in the Word morning reflection and middle of the week. And I hope that your week has started well, and I hope that your week ends well. And the passage we've been dealing with is Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. And we're talking about Christ teaching on stewardship. And so yesterday we looked at the parable that Christ taught, an unusual parable. And this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the teaching that Christ gives to elaborate his point with the parable. So, if you remember yesterday, we left off with the question, "What is Christ's point?" And this morning, we're going to really expand what we just generally talked about yesterday. So, again, that's Luke chapter 16. We'll begin reading in verse number 1. And he said also unto his disciples, There was a certain rich man which had a steward. And the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an accounting of thy stewardship, for thou mayest may no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig. To beg I'm ashamed. I'm resolved what to do, that when I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. Now, yesterday we talked about what the steward did. And in fact, what he did was unjust, but it was also very shrewd. And that leaves us with the question, what is the point of Christ's teaching? Well, thankfully, when we deal with parables, we can understand what the parable was intended to teach based on what Jesus teaches after that. And it's important for us to remember that when someone is looking at a proverb or looking at a parable, many times the truth is illustrated in a way that presents it veiled initially, and then as we dig into it, it leaves us with an illustration that helps us to understand the truth. And so that's what Jesus is doing here. He veils the truth with an unusual story, but then he's going to use that story to illustrate some extremely important principles about the concept of stewardship. And so let's look at what Jesus said here. In verses 8 and 9, he says, The children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. This is Christ's commentary on the parable. I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, he's referring to money, so that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. Now, from this statement, Jesus is also going to expand it into some other areas related to stewardship. And so his general purpose in giving this parable, the direct application, is that worldly people are often more practical than Christians. When I say practical, what I mean is they approach making decisions with a more practical disposition sometimes than Christians. And I've observed this. I hate to say this, but it's true. A lot of Christians overanalyze certain things, and obviously we want to be principled in how we make decisions. We want to make decisions with a biblical worldview. But sometimes Christians over-spiritualize it. They get very emotionally intertwined with these decisions, and they try to make decisions based upon, I would say, feelings, and sometimes they associate or attribute that with the Holy Spirit's guidance. And so in verse number 8, he says that the children of the world are wiser in their generation than the children of the light. But that's really not what Jesus is getting at. Not, oh, well, Christians are more mystical than non-Christians. He's actually getting at something slightly different. He's saying you need to use material possessions for the advance of God's kingdom. If these people use material possessions to advance themselves temporally, how much more should we advance, we could say, the blessings we'll experience in eternity based on how we use material things here? That's really what he's saying. He's saying, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when they fail, they may receive into everlasting habitations. Now, we're going to have to break this down a little bit further, and especially when we get to the application side tomorrow, Lord willing, you'll understand a little bit better what he's saying. But when he uses the term mammon of unrighteousness, don't think a sinful use of money. Think of it in terms of money is a means of exchange that can be used for good or for bad. And so in this world, it is used for both good and for bad. And so he's saying use material possessions for the advancement of something eternal. That's what he's getting at. Then we see further explanation. Those who do this are going to experience the benefit of that investment forever. When ye fail, we're all going to die. they may receive you into everlasting habitation. Well, who is the they? These are the people whose lives have been touched by how you use material things here. And so this brings up a fascinating consideration. People who use the material world correctly are going to invest it in people who are eternal. They're going to spend eternity somewhere, and they will actually be able to have an interaction with them forever. I mean, one of the easiest examples of this would be for a parent. So if you think about it, we clothe our children, we feed our children, we school our children. We invest a tremendous amount of material resource into our children. And in the end, Lord willing, if we've invested not just in them materially, but we've invested in the growth of their understanding of the gospel, and we've pointed them to Christ, and we've led them to Christ, and we help them grow as disciples of Christ once they've been saved, we're going to be able to experience the eternal blessing of having used those resources, temporal resources, wisely. So this is kind of the idea of what he's getting into. But Christ is also going to give kind of a corollary teaching to this very direct teaching. For instance, in verses 10 through 13, he says, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If you've not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another man's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or also hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." So think about what Jesus is saying. I want to break it down into some just very simple principles. The first principle is that faithfulness is not determined by how much we have, but by what we do with what we're given. Sometimes we prop up individuals that are very talented. They become very well known. Maybe someone's a pastor and they pastor a massive church, or a missionary who sends back these glowing prayer letters, or someone who becomes very wealthy and they're very giving of how they use their money. And we kind of prop up those individuals because the visible things that we can see, they really are impressive. But this principle reminds us that it's not about what you see, it's about what God sees. Because when God gives somebody something, what they do with it is something that he knows better than anyone else. And so some of the people that seem very unassuming, who've actually been faithful with just a little bit, are going to receive a far greater weight of reward than those who were given a lot. And it's true, they did a lot, but in proportion, they really didn't do much with what they had. The second principle, we see that in verse 10, is if we do not manage the little things well, then he will not give us greater things. And so in verse 11, he says, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, the physical things, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And so we have this other principle, that if you do not do what you should with what you're given that is of lesser value and of lesser significance, then why in the world would God entrust to you something far more weighty and far more substantial? It's like a person who wants to do great things for God, but they don't do the most basic things in their daily lives. They don't do the things that are just the building blocks of a well-ordered life, and a life that God will be able to use. And so we should especially encourage our young people to be faithful in the little things. As a teenager, as a young person, as a college student, do what is right in the most basic things of life, and then let God give you the opportunities that he wants to give you later in life. If we cannot manage resources with accountability, then why would someone remove that accountability? And so the next verse that we see is in verse 12. If you've not been faithful in that which is another man's, meaning you answer to somebody, they're going to look over your shoulder and say, what did you do with what I gave you? Then who's going to give you that which is your own? Why would God give you something that you are to manage independent without that accountability? And so the point is that if you cannot do your job appropriately with somebody constantly saying, why didn't you do it this way? And make sure that you do it this way, and don't forget this. If you have someone who's constantly got to be encouraging you and reminding you, and you don't have that internal motivation yourself, then why would God give you something that involves a far greater level of responsibility when you will not have people looking over your shoulder and asking you, did you do this? Why didn't you do this? How did you do this? So important that we understand this principle. The last principle is we cannot serve God and the things of this world at the same time. No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And so the point of this whole section is that we are not to set our heart on material things, but we are to use material things for the advancement of God's kingdom. And that's what stewardship is all about. It's recognizing if God gives us something small, we need to do the best we can with what he's given. It recognizes that God takes note of how we manage things, whether they're large things or small things, and he's going to reward us accordingly. It's a reminder that if we can't do what is right with accountability, we most certainly will not do right without accountability. It's a reminder that we should live for the Lord and use the things of this world for his benefit, not live with a heart that has been captured by the things of this world. Well, I hope that gives you some things to think about this morning. Have a great rest of your day. And again, if this has encouraged you, please share that. If you think someone could benefit from it, share it with them. Have a great day. Lord willing, we will meet again tomorrow. Bye now.